Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're cracking open a subject that's often just whispered about if it's talked about at all.
It's one of those things that so many people carry as a secret.
Exactly. And we're going to confront it directly, especially within the context of many traditional Asian our sources today are very specific. Vietnamese family structures. We are diving into what one source describes as the silent crack. This profound, unspoken, and often really tragic reality that happens when children are seen not as individuals, but as parental assets.
And not just assets, but as a mandatory retirement plan.
That's the core of it, isn't it? A living life insurance policy.
And this is so much more than a financial discussion. I mean, it's an existential burden. It's that moment, that dawning realization for a young adult when they wake up and see that their entire life, their whole trajectory, it's fundamentally constrained.
Sometimes catastrophically.
Yes, catastrophically. By the previous generations, let's be frank, lack of financial and emotional preparation for their own future.
And you find yourself just stuck in this impossible space between, on the one hand, a deeply ingrained moral obligation, filial piety, and on the other, this just terrifying anxiety.
The anxiety of realizing your own future, your own choices, from your career to who you marry to where you even live, it's all contingent on servicing a debt you never ever agreed to.
That feeling of being a living life insurance policy, as research puts it, it's just a psychological pressure cooker.
It is.
So we've synthesized a lot of source material for this. We're pulling from cultural observations, deep psychological analysis, and some philosophical frameworks.
Our mission for this deep dive is, I think, really clear. First, we have to explore the historical and cultural roots that made this pattern, almost inevitable for the older generation.
Right. Context is key.
Second, we need to really analyze the emotional damage that results from this. The chronic guilt, the loss of identity, what some sources call the premature aging of the younger generation.
And third, and this is the most important part,
this is the goal, yes. We have to extract practical, applicable strategies. We're rooting them in philosophies like Existentialism and Stoicism to help the younger generation break this cycle.
And crucially, breaking it without necessarily being forced to, completely sever family ties.
Our goal here is to give you, the listener, both understanding and agency. We want to provide the vocabulary, the framework, to help you realize that this conflict you might be feeling, it's structural, it's historical, it's economic.
It is not a personal failing.
Absolutely not. It's not about judging who is right or who is wrong. It's about recognizing that two generations are, in many ways, operating on entirely different, completely incompatible worldviews.
And you're the one caught in the middle.
Exactly. And we need to analyze this structure so you can start to dismantle its hold on your life.
Okay, so let's start right where the pain begins. Let's talk about the language of obligation. Because for anyone who grew up in this cultural model, the phrases that are used to enforce this perpetual debt, they're instantly recognizable.
Oh, absolutely. And they are not just nagging remarks. I mean, that's an understatement. They are the verbal manifestation of a contract you never signed.
But are absolutely expected to honor.
These phrases are tools. They are cultural tools designed to emotionally load every single exchange. They act as these deep psychological anchors.
So think about some of the ones our sources cite. They're so direct, almost brutally transactional, like this one. Having children is so they can take care of us later.
Right. I mean, listen to that. That isn't a hope or a wish. It's a declaration of purpose.
It's a business plan.
It is. The child's very birth is retroactively framed as an investment strategy.
And then there's the repayment language. The constant reminder that your education, the food on your table, your upbringing, it wasn't an act of unconditional love, it was a loan.
A loan that must be repaid. With interest. The classic one is, we raised you, now you must repay that debt of gratitude.
So what happens to a person psychologically when gratitude is weaponized like that, when it becomes a permanent debt?
It creates a state of perpetual emotional scarcity. You can never, ever be good enough. You can never do enough because the debt itself is designed to be infinite. The goalposts are always moving.
And nothing, I think, is more damaging than the comparison trap.
Oh, the comparison trap. That's the one that really gets under the skin.
The constant social pressure. Other people's children managed it, why can't you?
Using the neighbor's kid as a stick to beat you with. And what that really shows is that the parent's primary concern in that moment is social appearance. It's the security of their asset portfolio, not your individual happiness or your unique path.
So when you combine all that language, you get this immense internal conflict. The source material really forces the young adult to start unpacking the core injustices of this inherited system.
First and foremost, you have to ask, why is this duty of care considered a mandatory given, an implicit term of your very existence?
Instead of a voluntary choice.
Instead of a choice made out of genuine adult love and respect, when obligation replaces choice, authentic connection just dies on the vine.
And this is where the resentment really starts to brew, isn't it? The second question.
Yes. Why must you pay for decisions, specifically the parents' lack of retirement planning or their financial preparation, in which you had absolutely no input?
None.
You are being held financially and emotionally responsible for circumstances that were set in motion decades before you were even capable of making a decision.
It's the ultimate generational bailout. And the deepest pain point, I think, is what you mentioned earlier. The fusing of love and obligation.
It's a toxic fusion.
If I choose a life path that makes me happy, but maybe doesn't maximize my income for your retirement, does that mean I don't love you?
And the culture has successfully and tragically merged genuine affection with transactional servitude. It makes it nearly impossible to separate the two without feeling like you are completely morally bankrupt.
The psychological impact of that fusion, it's that you learn from a very young age that your authentic self, your true desires, your boundaries, your needs is secondary.
It's secondary to the parent's comfort. You learn that love is conditional. It's conditional upon your performance and, frankly, upon your financial utility.
And that is a profound warping of what family is supposed to mean.
It is.
So let's look outward for a second. What do the societal structures, school, culture, the community, what do they teach instead of the skills you would actually need to navigate this? How to set healthy boundaries.
Well, the sources are pretty damning on this. Society teaches obedience, not fairness. The entire system rewards the good child.
And the good child is the one who...
The one who suppresses their feelings, who bows their head, who accepts the burden without asking critical questions. This deep-seated training in obedience means that by the time you're 25, you're often incapable of even articulating a fair request, let alone negotiating a financial boundary.
And the schooling system just reinforces this deference, right? It's not just about academics.
Not at all. We focus on intellectual skills, sure, but the social training is all about deference, about humility, about avoiding conflict. It's not about teaching essential adult skills like negotiation or communication or, God forbid, critical thinking about your role within potentially oppressive family structures.
And the culture itself.
Yeah.
It just demands sacrifice. It elevates self-negation. The idea that parents are used to suffering or that they sacrifice for the child, that's held up as the highest moral standard.
Exactly. But this teaching fundamentally neglects to equip you with the most crucial skill of all, setting limits, setting boundaries. If sacrifice is the moral pinnacle, then a boundary is moral treason.
And that leads us directly into this concept of the generational loop, the silent tragedy that just keeps perpetuating itself. Can you walk us through that sequence one more time?
It begins with the parents' lack of preparation for their own old age. So, consciously or not, they start to view their child as the necessary survival tool.
The insurance policy.
The insurance policy. The child then grows up steeped in this culture of fear and financial obligation. They internalize this idea that failure is not an option because if they fail, the entire family will suffer.
And then they reach adulthood.
And by then, they're often emotionally hardened, deeply burnt out, or just financially crippled from carrying the weight of the previous generation.
And the most tragic part.
They often, sometimes completely unconsciously, repeat the exact same model with their own children.
Wow.
Because they've lived through the pain, but they lack the emotional tools to break free from the only structure they've ever known. Or they become so terrified of becoming the burden that they double down on control over their own kids to prevent it.
So the cycle just reinforces itself decade after decade.
It does. And this is where a philosophical lens, particularly from existentialism, becomes absolutely essential. It gives us the vocabulary to understand the nature of this performance.
A performance.
Yeah.
That's a powerful way to put it.
The existential view would suggest that many people dedicate their entire lives to being the standard child that society dictates, the version that maximizes parental pride and financial security.
Rather than the authentic, autonomous person they actually want to be.
Precisely. Your child self gets trapped in this constant performance mode. You're striving for specific degrees, specific jobs, sending specific amounts of money home, all to fulfill an external manufactured role.
And the second you try to step out of that role,
The system instantly labels your true desires as selfish.
the ultimate crime.
Yes. Living for oneself is the greatest crime in this cultural framework. Existentialism, drawing on figures like Jean-Paul Sartre, it highlights that humans are fundamentally condemned to be free.
Condemned to be free. What does that mean exactly?
It means we are responsible for defining our own lives. And when we fail to do that, when we live merely to please others, we are acting in what Sartre called bad faith.
We're being inauthentic.
We're being inauthentic. If we stay in this vortex, constantly performing to secure a parent's approval and stability, we don't just lose our freedom, we lose the most authentic, unique version of who we were meant to be. It is a loss that compounds daily, and it leads to this deep existential exhaustion.
And the profound reality is that young people today are bearing the very real financial cost of their parents' history. I mean, we see them postponing marriage, covering long-term medical costs, deferring their own entrepreneurial dreams.
All because they didn't have a choice in the prior generation's financial path.
They're living two lives at once, the one they desperately want to pursue, and the one that has to stay tightly bound by this thread of duty just to keep the family from falling apart.
Well, to criticize the system without understanding where it came from is, I think, unproductive. We have to shift now to the historical context.
Right, not to excuse the behavior.
Not at all, but to grasp the immense pressure and frankly, the lack of options the previous generation faced. The sources are so insistent that this lack of preparation was, in the vast majority of cases, not an act of irresponsibility.
It was a complete lack of opportunity.
A lack of opportunity and a lack of context to even think about the future.
That distinction, lack of opportunity versus irresponsibility, that feels crucial. We can't judge their actions by today's standards of, global financial literacy.
You can't. The primary context is survival. For the older generation, thinking 20 or 30 years ahead was quite literally a luxury they could not afford. Survival consumed every resource they had.
They were just trying to get through the day, the week, the month.
Exactly. They grew up amidst extreme poverty, prolonged scarcity, or in the immediate aftermath of devastating wars and political instability. The social fabric was completely fractured.
So they just didn't have the conceptual framework, let alone the tools that we now take for granted.
Things like diversified retirement funds, comprehensive insurance policies, emergency savings reserves beyond, a few bundles of gold or some cash hidden away.
When all your energy is dedicated to securing food, clothing, basic healthcare, tuition for next month.
All planning is consumed by the present. The distant future was just. It was surrendered to necessity.
And this surrender takes us back centuries, doesn't it? To the lingering influence of what the sources call the agricultural mindset, this mental DNA.
This is the historical scaffolding of the whole problem. We are talking about the centuries-old, self-sufficient, agrarian family model.
And in that model, the logic was
ironclad. For generation after generation, it was simple. More children meant more labor. More labor meant more production and more stability. Children were quantifiable assets.
Then when parents grew old,
care was automatically and efficiently handled by the children because the concept of a state-funded safety net just did not exist. There was zero concept of personal space or individuality or separate goals.
the collective survival was the only goal.
The only goal. So even though society rapidly industrialized and transitioned to a market economy, moving from the rice fields to the cities, that mental DNA persisted, that assumption.
That children equals assets plus old age insurance.
It became unconsciously ingrained, the default operating system.
So they weren't consciously trying to create a burden for their kids.
Not at all. They were simply running the only program they inherited, believing it was the correct moral and financial strategy. They knew no other way to secure their old age.
And this structural issue was then compounded by a severe systemic lack of modern financial education.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the educational environment of the mid-20th century in these regions. There was a near-total absence of literature or institutional guidance or even social norms about investment, long-term insurance, or personal financial planning.
What was the advice back then?
It was rudimentary. Save cash under the mattress, buy gold if you have extra, maybe use a bank for basic security. No one taught them about compounding interest or mutual funds or the necessity of diversifying risk away from their children.
And crucially, no social narrative ever warned them that relying entirely on their offspring was a massive system-wide risk.
No. So the result was that default setting, children are our pension. In the absence of viable formal options, the family unit became the sole investment vehicle.
And this is all tied up with the cultural elevation of sacrifice, right? That being selfish is the worst thing you can be.
Intimately linked. The belief that thinking of oneself was fundamentally selfish created this moral obligation to neglect your own future. They internalized maxims like, parents are used to suffering, so we just accept hardship, or every spare penny must be saved for the children.
And that dedication was seen as high morality, as deep love.
It was. But the tragic consequence is that this very sacrifice created a financial vacuum. By channeling all their resources toward the immediate well-being of the child and neglecting their own retirement savings, they unwittingly transferred the entire massive cost of their non-preparedness onto the next generation.
A cultural habit that, without a financial plan, became a generational liability.
And on top of all that, we can't ignore the deep-seated distrust of the formal system itself. This generation lived through extreme volatility,
Political upheaval, currency collapse.
state systems that were fundamentally weak, corrupt, or unstable. They experienced low wages, negligible state insurance, rudimentary health care, and pension schemes that were often unreliable, if they existed at all.
So if the institutions, the state, the banks, the insurance markets, are all viewed as fundamentally unstable and untrustworthy, where do you place your faith?
You place it in the family. Children became the only trustworthy, reliable, self-renewing, and physically present betting pool for old age security.
So it wasn't necessarily a desire to be a burden.
It was the inevitable outcome of decades of institutional failure and the erosion of faith in any formal system.
And the result of all this is the establishment of this silent, unspoken law. The children are assets of the parents' culture. The child is scrutinized in every action, every expectation, every social judgment as an investment return.
A pride point.
And an absolute survival float. They're not born free, they're born into an economic plan. This friction becomes just painfully apparent when the younger generation, informed by global ideas of individualism and mental health, tries to deviate from the script. The moment you try to establish a boundary, the emotional reaction for the parental generation is often immediate and, emotionally devastating.
The vocabulary of the older generation is instantly deployed to protect the cultural structure. The moment a young person attempts autonomy, they are branded.
Ungrateful.
It's selfish.
And the ultimate condemnation, unfilial.
Yes, but you. And this is far beyond simple disapproval. This is a judgment that you are betraying the entire moral foundation of the family structure simply by asserting your own identity or your need for some private space.
It's truly a clash of emotional languages. The sources call it a communication crisis between two completely different operating systems.
That's a great way to put it. The older generation was programmed for survival, endurance, sacrifice, and the absolute suppression of emotion.
Right. They were taught that showing vulnerability was a weakness.
And that admitting fault or apologizing was unthinkable. Their existence was defined by quiet resilience and duty. They operated on this principle of collective, controlled emotion.
Meanwhile, the younger generation
is programmed for self-expression, mental health advocacy, personal boundaries, autonomy, and the necessity of healing past trauma. We talk about feelings, identity, individuality. These two systems are they're fundamentally incompatible.
So when one person speaks the language of, I need space,
the other only hears the language of rejection.
Let's explore some of those critical misinterpretations. This is where the emotional friction is most acute, because the intentions are just completely crossed.
So when the younger person says, I need some private time or space to pursue my passion, the parent, who is steeped in that agrarian model of collective closeness, they hear, you are alienating us, or even, you are ashamed of us.
Wow. And what about when a young person tries to pursue financial independence? Keeping their finances separate.
The parent interprets that as, you don't trust us with your money. Or even worse, you think we are poor and you're trying to hide your wealth from us.
And the simple act of setting a boundary is rarely, if ever, seen as a healthy, developmental step toward adulthood, is it?
Almost never. It is almost always perceived as a rejection of the parent's love, their sacrifice, and the entire moral contract. The parent internalizes it as, after all we have done for you, you are pushing us away.
And this profound misinterpretation is what activates the core parental fear engine.
Yes.
Explain that fear engine. Why do they react so aggressively when a simple boundary is set?
Because that boundary touches upon their deepest existential anxieties. Fears they never had the tools to confront, honestly.
Like what?
Fear of abandonment in old age is paramount. Fear of becoming meaningless once the child no longer needs their guidance. The fear that their children will succeed without them, thereby undermining the parent's core definition of value within the family structure.
So the young person's independence isn't just a lifestyle choice.
No, it threatens the entire narrative of the parent's self-worth. It challenges the only system they know for achieving security and purpose in life.
And it's crucial to remember that this strong defensive behavior, it stems from a deep-seated emotional illiteracy, not necessarily from intentional denial or cruelty.
That is so vital. The older generation lacks the vocabulary for healthy communication. Concepts like empathy, calm dialogue, acknowledging feelings, or apologizing, they simply were not taught.
And in many cases, were culturally punished as a sign of weakness.
Exactly. If you dared to articulate a disagreement, it was deemed insolence, disrespect. So when the younger generation says, "I feel significant emotional pressure," the automatic ingrained response is the script they learned.
Which is,
What pressure? We had it much harder and we didn't complain. They are reacting with the only tool their upbringing provided, which is to dismiss the pain as weakness.
let's dedicate some time to this distinction between gratitude and debt, because this is the mechanism that keeps the child trapped.
It's the core of the trap. Gratitude is a beautiful, voluntary response to kindness. Debt is a contractual obligation.
And the old culture deliberately corrupts one into the other.
It does. It corrupts the concept of gratitude into an endless, suffocating debt. Parents will use phrases like, "You owe us for the gift of life," or "You can never repay the hardship of raising you."
And this transforms the sacrifice of creation into
A perpetual state of never enough. The young person is psychologically trapped, constantly trying to pay off a debt whose metric for repayment is always shifting, forcing them into a life of sacrifice that never reaches zero.
Because if the metric is based on the parent's internal, invisible fear, then no amount of external success or financial contribution will ever satisfy it.
Exactly, and that's why the rules of this filial piety game are inherently rigged.
It's an unwinnable game.
It is. If you choose self-erasure living only to fulfill the obligation and make your parents comfortable, you experience internal pain, burnout, and you lose your identity.
But if you choose autonomy, setting boundaries, and living for yourself,
You struggle with crippling guilt and are condemned by everyone as selfish. The rules are set up to ensure that you are constantly forced to choose between two different forms of suffering. You're set up to always fail to meet that invisible, unachievable standard.
let's move to the profound psychological ownership that underlies this whole dynamic. This idea that the child is not an independent soul, but a vessel, a psychological extension of the parent's ego.
This is the most difficult layer to confront, I think.
Because this is why the rejection of a life choice feels like a catastrophic betrayal.
It is. In many of these families, the parent's personal self, their ego, was severely compressed, often broken by historical trauma. Poverty, war, collective ideology, gender norms that restricted any personal choice.
So they were never permitted to pursue a personal passion or choose their own authentic identity.
Never. And as a consequence, the child is unconsciously viewed as a continuation of that life, a second chance to live the life that was denied to the parent.
So the child isn't just supposed to take care of the parent financially. They're meant to carry the parent's entire emotional and professional backlog. This is the transfer of deferred dreams.
That's precisely right. The parent unconsciously uses the child's life to patch up their own unfulfilled ambitions. Maybe the mother always dreamed of higher education but was forced to work. She pushes the child relentlessly for a PhD.
Or the father missed out on a high-status professional career due to instability.
And he forces the child into that specific, stable field, say, medicine or engineering. The child becomes the living embodiment of the parent's most difficult trauma, the inability to accept their own constrained, incomplete life story.
And this explains the ferocity of the reaction when the child tries to pursue their own path. If the child refuses the parent's dream, "I want to be an artist, not an engineer," it's seen as far more than just a lifestyle choice.
It's seen as a fundamental rejection of the parent themselves, because the parent's dream and the child's life have become completely fused in the parental psyche. Rejecting the dream is seen as invalidating the parent's past sacrifice and their entire identity.
The parent feels, if you don't choose the life I wanted for you, then all my suffering was meaningless.
It's perceived as an existential betrayal, which triggers that deep, often desperate emotional response that we see.
And we have to address the investment mentality again here. Parents genuinely feel they have earned the right to decide the child's path because of their immense investment.
And that sacrifice is real. They did invest time, immense effort, their own health, money they didn't have. They believe this effort creates a binding contract and a right to a return on that investment. But we must reiterate the foundational truth from Stoicism here.
Yeah.
No one, not even a parent, has the right to own another human soul. Freedom cannot be bought, regardless of the price paid in sacrifice. The child is an independent, free entity, not a financial instrument to fulfill debt obligations or soothe historical trauma.
And this ownership concept gets amplified by the fact that many parents from that older generation lacked robust inner lives or goals outside the family structure.
This is a critical psychological observation from the sources. If a parent, due to historical constraints, lacks external hobbies or personal development goals or strong friendships outside of immediate family and work, the child becomes their sole source of joy.
Their purpose, their self-worth.
Everything. The child is the center of their entire universe. So when that child deviates from the defined script, the parent's life loses its entire meaning. That intense reaction isn't malice, it's a reaction to the perceived collapse of their entire purpose in life.
So the key existential truth is that we are all, as you said before, condemned to be free. This is both liberating and terrifying.
It is. We have to choose our own lives, even if that choice means accepting that we cannot fill the void in someone else's existence. Love, true love, has to be predicated on accepting the other person's existence as independent.
When a parent forces their unlived life onto their child, they don't just restrict the child.
They create a multi-generational tragedy where neither person is living authentically. The current generation must accept the burden of that freedom and choose to define themselves.
Let's shift now to the concrete, measurable damage this system inflicts on people. If you're living a life scripted by your parents' unfulfilled dreams and their financial anxieties, the result is this profound feeling of an unowned existence.
A life that isn't yours. And it often starts far too early. You might be an adult on paper, but you are not self-determining.
The loss of agency, that's the heavy cost.
You're functioning as an actor in a play written decades ago. You lose the ability to dream or self-determine around ages 18, 20, 25. The very years where exploration and making mistakes and defining your identity should be paramount.
Instead, you're instantly burdened with the weight of consequence.
And this ties into the previous generation's relentless prioritization of stability, which is understandable given their turbulent history.
But this focus on stability often actively works against the child's own development.
Well, stability for the older generation, it meant a secure job, a predictable income, a conventional life path. But that definition of stability is often optimized for the parent's comfort and their peace of mind, not for the child's passion or competence or their natural development curve.
So young people are frequently forced into career choices based on parental acceptance or their fear of instability, rather than their own calling.
And this leads to a career that is, as the sources put it, halfway, unstable, lacking identity. Because you never truly commit to a path that isn't your own. You just exist in a state of performance anxiety.
And that performance anxiety is deepened by a paralyzing chronic fear of failure.
This is the invisible burden that leads to exhaustion. Because the parents lack retirement funds or insurance or any financial cushion, that silent crack we talked about, the young person carries this immense external pressure.
The thought that if I fail, the entire family structure will sink, not just me.
Yes, and this is why a personal setback feels like a family catastrophe.
Can you walk us through what the source material describes as premature aging? What does this actually look like day to day for, say, a 25-year-old?
It's carrying the emotional, financial, and logistical load of a 45-year-old. It looks like taking on crippling family debt when you should be saving for your first home. It looks like managing chronic parental medical bills when your peers are traveling or investing in their own education.
It's mediating complex family conflicts.
Often between the parents themselves, because you are the only functionally rational adult in the room. You are denied the joy of an unburdened youth, the space to make mistakes, the ability to live lightly because you are forced to age for the parent.
And even when the younger generation is granted what looks like freedom, it often turns out to be conditional freedom.
The subtle control mechanisms are perhaps the most insidious.
Explain that. What is conditional freedom?
It's the permission to be autonomous, as long as that autonomy doesn't contradict the parent's core desires. Control is exercised not through direct commands, but through emotional manipulation and passive aggression.
What are the tools for that?
The sources detail them. It's the deep, silent sigh when you mention an unconventional career path. It's the sudden, pervasive silence when you reveal a new relationship they don't approve of. It's the constant, subtle comparison to other, more compliant children.
And the young person who is programmed to prioritize collective harmony, sees that sadness and immediately stops living for themselves.
Correct. The child is taught that the sight of parental disappointment is evidence of their own moral failure. They trade their authenticity, their free, unique life for the comfort of the parent. Existentialism would term this dying slowly within one's own life.
You sacrifice your true identity to avoid causing anxiety in others, only to inherit that anxiety and internalize the guilt.
It's a tragic exchange.
And no matter how successful the young person becomes, the not enough syndrome persists. Why is that standard so unachievable?
Because the metric you're being judged against is not based on external reality, your salary, your achievements, your reputation. It's based on the parent's internal, intangible fear and their catalog of unachieved dreams.
It's an invisible, constantly shifting, and unachievable standard.
Exactly. You can send $1,000 home, but the fear of old age remains. So the parent's underlying need, which is security, not just money, is never met. This perpetual not enough shrinks your world. It fosters chronic guilt, stress, depression, and a loss of future direction.
You're exhausted not because you're weak,
but because you are fighting a structural, cultural model that is fundamentally unfair and decades old.
The psychological cost is just enormous. It's this loop of responsibility, obligation, and chronic exhaustion, designed to keep you focused entirely on managing external expectations rather than pursuing your own internal growth.
We have spent a lot of time now dissecting the structure of the problem. We have to transition fully to the solution. The younger generation needs a viable, principled path to autonomy, a way to reclaim their life and establish independence without destroying the bonds of family entirely.
This is the segment the listener needs most.
And the roadmap provided by our sources relies heavily on existential and Stoic philosophy.
Okay, but let me challenge that immediately. How can philosophy solve the very real, very immediate problem of having to pay your mother's rent next month?
That is a necessary challenge. And the answer is, philosophy doesn't solve the immediate financial crisis. It solves the internal crisis that allows the financial crisis to control your self-identity. It gives you the necessary mental armor and the structure to build the material solutions.
Okay, so where do we start?
The very first step, according to existentialism, is difficult but absolutely non-negotiable. Acceptance.
Acceptance of what?
Existential acceptance means acknowledging the painful truth. No one is obligated to change, to understand you, or to release you from their burdens. Waiting for your parents or society to suddenly change their perspectives is, to borrow from Camus, the hell of expecting others to be different.
So you stop waiting for permission to be free.
You stop waiting. True freedom is built by choosing one's life within those painful, non-negotiable limitations. We must accept that our parents may never truly approve, but we still retain the absolute right to define our own lives.
That acceptance is hard, though, because it forces you to realize you may never get the emotional validation you crave.
It requires deep emotional maturity. And this is where Stoic differentiation becomes our most powerful practical tool. Stoicism teaches us to draw a clear line between what is controllable and what is not.
Okay, so what's uncontrollable?
How our parents think, what judgments they pass, how they feel when we make independent choices. Those are outside our sphere of influence, and worrying about them is wasted energy.
But the controllable sphere includes
how we construct our own life, the boundaries we maintain, and crucially, how we react to their expectations and their emotional pressure. The goal is to offer voluntary, compassionate help within robustly defined means, but never to trade your future or your self-identity for their momentary comfort.
So Stoicism offers clarity. It helps separate duty from forced servitude.
Precisely. It teaches us to honor our commitments without sacrificing our soul.
Okay, so philosophy provides the armor, but autonomy requires a physical structure. The sources define 3 pillars essential for building a life free from this inherited burden. Let's start with the most tangible, financial freedom.
Pillar 1, the financial foundation. Autonomy begins not with high wealth, but with robust financial independence. This pillar aims to achieve 3 critical stages.
What are they?
First, zero reliance on the family for anything. Second, ensuring that you will never become a financial burden on your family or later your own children. And third, establishing a significant safety buffer for personal crises.
Let's focus on that third stage. Why is the safety buffer so critical in breaking the cycle?
The buffer is the anti-fragility mechanism. When you live hand-to-mouth, one unexpected event, a job loss, a medical bill, a car accident, can immediately pull you back into that old dependent model.
Right. It forces you to seek family support or accept their dictates in exchange for stability.
Exactly. Financial resilience removes the parent's primary power card. They may still disapprove of your career, but they cannot legally or financially demand you change it if you are stable and independent. Your financial self-authorship is the first step towards self-authorship in life.
Okay, pillar 2. This one deals with the pervasive, culturally weaponized guilt.
Pillar 2, the emotional foundation. This is the ability to radically differentiate your emotions from the emotions of others. When a parent says, "You make us sad," or "You are abandoning us," you must internally recognize that this reflects their fear, their interpretation, and their disappointment.
Not objective proof that you're morally wrong or a failure.
Exactly. You have to recognize their sadness without allowing it to dictate your behavior. The Stoic lesson resurfaces here. Suffering comes not from the event, the site of their sadness, but from our interpretation of it, our internalized guilt that we are responsible for their feelings.
So you separate love from responsibility for their happiness.
You can love them fiercely, but you are not responsible for managing their internal emotional state. Building this foundation means recognizing guilt as a cultural tool rather than an accurate barometer of your moral worth.
And the final pillar is perhaps the most profound, the inner resolve.
Pillar 3, the spiritual or existential foundation. This is the deep realization that no one will save you and no one can live your life for you. This strength allows you to accept the inevitable loneliness that comes with standing up for yourself.
Because when you choose a path of self-authorship, you often become the black sheep.
Or the one who is misunderstood. This spiritual independence ensures that when the family uses guilt or appeals to collective harmony, your sense of self is strong enough to resist the pullback into conformity. It gives you the courage to choose responsibility for your own life.
So once these 3 foundations are robust, we can move to the actual confrontation, setting boundaries. But confrontation in this context is often counterproductive.
Oh, absolutely. The sources stress that finesse, not firepower, is required.
So what's the first step?
You must first build the circle of freedom. I cannot stress this enough. A boundary without a foundation is defenseless. You must secure financial freedom, environmental freedom, even if it's just moving into a separate apartment, and identity freedom, knowing your non-negotiable values before attempting any serious dialogue.
Because this shift in circumstance automatically reduces their controlling power.
It removes the levels they can pull.
And when dialogue becomes necessary, the tactic of indirect dialogue is suggested. But isn't using indirect language just a form of hypocrisy or avoidance?
That's an excellent challenge. It's not hypocrisy. It is skillful behavior. It's about translating your autonomous needs into a language your parents are structurally capable of understanding.
So you avoid the emotional language that triggers their defense mechanisms.
You avoid saying things like, "I need to be happy," or "I won't carry your future." That language just confirms their fear that you're selfish.
So how do we translate freedom into the language of security? Give us a script.
You focus entirely on stability and your capacity for future support. For example, if you need to switch careers to a less stable field, you don't talk about passion. You say, "I need to build this specific foundation now, even if it looks risky, so that I can earn more effectively and sustainably for a longer time. This ensures I can help you more robustly when you need me most."
You're translating personal growth into family security.
Exactly. Or when setting financial boundaries, you state, "I am actively building a high-level safety net for myself and for you, which requires discipline, so I need to maintain this specific budget for the next 3 years."
This allows the action to remain consistent while softening the emotional blow of the declaration.
Precisely. And we must also implement soft boundaries. Avoid hard confrontation or absolute declarations like, "I will never do that."
Instead, use gentle firmness and consistency.
Say, "I hear your concern, but I must follow this path because I need a life that aligns with my values." You are stating a truth about your identity, not issuing a hostile command. You are consistent in your behavior, you don't change your path, but you maintain politeness, avoiding the initiation of an emotional war.
And the crucial element here, the sources emphasize, is consistency over declaration.
Family structures trust behavior far more than they trust grand declarations of independence. A big, disruptive speech often just creates trauma and retaliation.
Small, consistent actions are far more effective.
Infinitely more. Stop sending money monthly if that's your boundary. Politely divert conversations about your personal choices. Simply stop asking for career input. This steady, non-negotiable, repetitive behavior signals the new reality. Over time, the old control mechanisms become ineffective because they encounter a wall of consistent, polite refusal, not an emotional explosion.
And finally, resisting the guilt trip requires that highly developed immune system we talked about.
You have to recognize guilt instantly as a cultural tool, not a moral truth. A key rule here. Do not make decisions while you are feeling guilt or conflict.
So if they deploy guilt,
Acknowledge their feeling, I understand this worries you, but immediately maintain your default script and disengage. And never, ever over-explain. In the old cultural system, over-explaining is universally perceived as weakness.
an opening for negotiation.
Or as proof that you know you're secretly wrong. Be concise, be kind, and be absolutely consistent.
The ultimate responsibility for this generation, then, is not just self-liberation, but ensuring that this painful structure ends right here. We are the break point.
We carry that heavy role of being the first generation to really recognize this issue, to have the vocabulary for it, and to possess the agency to stop it. We cannot fix the past, but our primary moral duty is to consciously design the future. We have to ensure this model stops with us.
And this requires a fundamental redefinition of kinship and filial piety for the future.
The old definition was simple: unconditional obedience and lifelong servitude. The new definition, informed by everything we've discussed, is self-sufficiency combined with kindness,
So we have to consciously establish a new family model.
where children are recognized as individuals, companions, friends, but absolutely not as guaranteed retirement funds. Love is voluntary accompaniment, not forced obligation. We teach our future children to be financially and emotionally self-sufficient, ensuring they are not forced to repeat our struggle.
And what about the final, profound declaration that ensures the cycle is broken forever?
If the current generation chooses to have children, they must consciously state and internalize this truth. You are not my unfinished youth. You are not my retirement insurance. You are not responsible for my happiness or my security.
You are a free soul, and my duty is to protect that freedom, not possess it.
When we make that declaration and live by its rules, by planning our own old age, managing our own emotional needs, and actively pursuing our own personal goals outside the children, that is the only ultimate, immediate, and unconditional cycle breaker. It is the end of the debt.
This has been an extensive and I think a really necessary journey through a complex emotional, economic, and cultural landscape. We started by defining that silent crack, the profound burden of care and financial obligation placed on the younger generation.
A burden born from historical scarcity and a lack of planning from the previous one.
We analyzed the roots, recognizing that the origins were not malice, but survival mechanisms, the remnants of the agrarian mindset, and the institutional failure to provide modern safety nets.
We then confronted the heavy cost. The chronic guilt, the profound feeling of an unowned life, and the premature aging caused by fighting a war against both external reality and your own internalized moral pressure.
But the focus, ultimately, is on action. We have adopted these principal strategies rooted in Stoicism and Existentialism. The way out is not about running away, it is an act of meticulous construction.
Building robust financial, emotional, and spiritual foundations. True maturity means achieving the strength to love your parents, to offer voluntary support from a place of strength, while absolutely retaining your self-identity and your autonomy.
We have to stop being defined by the past.
We must become the generation that looks honestly at the pain we inherited, not to retaliate or assign eternal blame, but to design a future that is free from that invisible inherited debt. We are the architects of a new family model.
One built on freedom, choice, and voluntary kindness, rather than historical obligation.
Exactly.
We are the first generation to consciously ask these fundamental questions with the resources and the philosophical tools necessary for an answer. We are not victims of history, but the intersection of two conflicting eras. Our only true power lies in choosing the era we belong to, and choosing to be the generation that ends the debt, begins the freedom, and refuses to let any child be viewed as a mere asset or a mandatory survival float. The final question for you, the listener, is not whether you can ever fully fix your parents' past, but whether you will allow that past to irrevocably dictate your future. The time to choose is now.